In a world where kindness often goes unnoticed, one man's selfless act of fixing a stranded car becomes the catalyst for an unexpected chain of events. What happens when a struggling father, down on his luck, helps a woman in need, and a day later finds himself the target of a series of unbelievable events? This is the story of a humble mechanic, an ungrateful society, and the explosive consequences that follow one act of kindness. Marcus, a hardworking single father, had learned the hard way that life wasn't about waiting for opportunities, it was about making the most of whatever came his way. Each day was a challenge, a tightrope walk between balancing the needs of his two children and scraping by with his job as a mechanic. His family lived in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of town, far from the glitzy world of city lights and financial stability. But for Marcus, the dust-covered roads and rusted fences were more than just the setting of his life, they were a symbol of resilience. Every morning, he would rise early, before the sun crested the horizon, to prepare his kids for school. He made them breakfast with whatever he had: cereal, toast, or sometimes just a cup of warm milk. After sending them off, he'd head to his small workshop in the back of the trailer, hoping to make enough money to pay bills and feed his family. His truck, which was older than his children, was a constant reminder of the harshness of his circumstances. He kept it running on the thinnest of threads, carefully patching up problems with his mechanical skills and whatever spare parts he could afford. Life wasn't easy, but it was his. Every wrench turn, every fix, every repair on someone else's vehicle kept his family fed, if not comfortable. It wasn't much, but Marcus had a deep sense of pride in his work. As a mechanic, he could fix almost anything that came through the door, but he couldn't always fix the things that mattered most: the debt piling up or the worries that gnawed at him as he lay awake at night. One afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly on the dry, cracked earth of his property, Marcus found himself working under the hood of his truck. The engine groaned and sputtered as he tried to coax a few more miles out of it. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his muscles ached from the constant manual labor. But Marcus was used to it. He'd always been a man of few words, preferring action over conversation. His world was built on hard work, and he had no illusions about it. It was then, amidst the familiar rhythm of his work, that he noticed a car slowly pull up in front of his trailer. The vehicle, a sleek white sedan, gleamed in stark contrast to the aging surroundings. The woman behind the wheel looked out of place in this neighborhood. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive business attire seemed at odds with the dusty dirt roads that led to Marcus's home. The car's engine stalled as it came to a stop, and the woman stepped out, her face flushed with frustration. Marcus wasn't one to judge people by their appearances. He had learned long ago not to assume things about others. But something about her seemed out of place, like a stranger in a foreign land. She stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do next. She was visibly upset, her hands resting on her hips as she glanced around, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The heat of the day only seemed to amplify her discomfort, and it was clear that she wasn't used to this kind of situation. Elizabeth, as she introduced herself when Marcus walked over, had been driving for hours when her car suddenly conked out. She was in a hurry, heading to an important meeting across town, but now she was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no one to help. The frustration in her voice was palpable, but there was something else too, a hint of embarrassment. She wasn't accustomed to relying on anyone for help. It was the first time in a long time that she had felt vulnerable, and it made her uneasy. Marcus knew that feeling all too well. He had been vulnerable too, many times in his life, and it was something he had learned to live with. But there was something about Elizabeth's predicament that triggered a sense of empathy in him. He could see the panic in her eyes, the uncertainty that comes from being in an unfamiliar place without control over the situation. Without hesitating, he offered to take a look at the car. He was no stranger to fixing things for people in need, and it wasn't as if he had any better plans. His own problems were still waiting for him, but Marcus never turned down an opportunity to help someone else. There was something fulfilling about it, something that made him feel like he wasn't just a man scraping by, He was someone who could make a difference, even in small ways. His own struggles, while overwhelming at times, didn't prevent him from being kind. If anything, they made him more understanding. As he knelt by the car, lifting the hood to inspect the engine, Marcus was reminded of the many times he had helped others who were in distress. Some had been grateful, others less so, but Marcus had learned not to expect anything in return. It was part of the deal. He did what he could, and that was enough. It wasn't about what he could gain, it was about doing the right thing. Elizabeth watched him work, her anxiety slowly turning into awe. She had expected the worst, a hefty bill for repairs, maybe a lecture about her poor maintenance of the car. But Marcus didn't judge her. He simply fixed the problem, taking his time to ensure that everything was back in working order. The problem was minor, a fuse that had blown, something that could be easily fixed with a spare part and a few minutes of work. As Marcus finished and handed her the keys, Elizabeth expressed her thanks, her voice sincere, but tinged with an unease she couldn't quite hide. She promised to return the favor, though she seemed uncertain about how she could. Marcus waved her off with a simple smile. He didn't need her to repay him. For him, the satisfaction came from knowing that he had helped, that he had been a small beacon of kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent. It was enough. But what Marcus didn't know was that this simple act of kindness was about to turn his world upside down. What began as a quick fix would soon unfold into a series of events that would change the course of his life forever. As Marcus began working on the car, the familiarity of the task allowed him to quickly focus. He immediately identified the problem. A blown fuse had short-circuited the engine. For most, this would be a source of panic, but to Marcus, it was a simple fix. His hands moved with confidence, knowing exactly where each tool needed to go. His years of experience in his trade had made him adept at solving problems, no matter how big or small. He approached the engine methodically, never rushing, knowing that precision was key to any successful repair. During the repair, Elizabeth lingered nearby, clearly anxious but trying to mask it. She had started to ask questions about his work, about how he knew so much about car mechanics. Her curiosity seemed genuine, yet there was an underlying tension in the way she carried herself. She was used to a certain level of professionalism and order, a world far removed from the greasy mechanics of Marcus's trade. As he spoke about his experience, he noticed her discomfort. Perhaps she wasn't used to conversing with someone from such a different background. However, Marcus didn't focus too much on these differences. It didn't matter to him who she was or what she did. For him, it was just about fixing the car and moving on. The engine was soon running smoothly again, the problem resolved. Elizabeth, though visibly relieved, thanked him profusely. She seemed almost embarrassed, as though unsure of how to express her gratitude. Marcus could sense the awkwardness in the air, the disparity between their lives, making the interaction feel somewhat strained. But as always, he chose not to dwell on it. Over the years, he had learned not to expect much in terms of recognition or repayment. His role was simple: to help fix and move forward. Before she left, Elizabeth promised to repay him for his kindness, although there was an uncertainty in her words. Marcus, however, wasn't focused on that promise. He had been down that road before, knowing that often people who were helped tended to forget the favor once it was done. As she drove away, he didn't expect anything more. But little did he know, the simple act of fixing her car was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of something far bigger. The next morning, Marcus was greeted by an unexpected sound, tires crunching over gravel. His instincts told him it was too early for anyone to be visiting, and the noise immediately caught his attention. As he stepped outside, what he saw made his heart race. 12 luxury SUVs were lined up in front of his humble trailer. This sight was nothing short of surreal. The vehicles were expensive and pristine, a stark contrast to his worn-down surroundings. The polished exteriors gleamed in the morning sun, and the people inside the cars appeared distant and unreadable. Among the crowd, Elizabeth stepped out of one of the vehicles. Gone was the woman who had arrived the day before, frazzled and grateful. This time, She was dressed in even more immaculate attire, radiating an air of authority. She was different, not just in appearance, but in the way she carried herself. The woman who had once seemed like a stranger in need was now something else entirely. She was part of a world that Marcus had no idea existed, one that was far beyond the simple, modest life he had carved out for himself. Elizabeth's voice cut through the tension, her tone more businesslike now than it had been the day before. "Marcus," she said, her words direct and deliberate, "we need to talk." What followed was a series of events that Marcus could never have anticipated. He had gone from a quiet day of work to being thrust into a whirlwind of people who were clearly part of a high-stakes world he had no knowledge of. Business deals, conversations of power, and professional intimidation filled the air. People who should have been out of reach, living in entirely different social circles, were now standing in front of him, their motives unclear. Elizabeth wasn't just a stranger in need. She was someone connected to a network of influence that Marcus could hardly fathom. What had started as an innocent act of kindness, a simple car repair, had now spiraled into something much more complex, a situation that Marcus wasn't equipped to navigate. As he stood there, realizing the gravity of the situation, he understood that his life was no longer what it had been just a day ago. The encounter had pulled him into a web of intrigue, a world where his every move would now be watched. Don't miss out on the shocking twists. Subscribe to expect stories for more unbelievable tales.